Welcome to Sleepy Sagas, where historical figures come to entertain your sleep. A world of death. In the 14th century, Central Asia was consumed by chaos and fear, a land where endless wars raged. Tamerlane, with blood-stained hands, emerged from the shadows, bringing with him a vision of brutality that would eclipse everything in his path. A living nightmare, not a ruler, but a monster with an insatiable thirst for power, Tamerlane's ambition was not just to conquer, but to annihilate. His journey was a campaign marked by agony, bloodshed, and despair. Terrifying imagery. To his enemies, Tamerlane was not just a tyrant. He was punishment incarnate, the embodiment of death itself. His rule was marked by grotesque sights. Towers made of human skulls, burning flesh, and cities turned into rivers of blood. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. Tamerlane, the infamous conqueror, was not born with the destiny of a ruler. He was born with the soul of a bandit, a predator with no moral compass, no sense of right or wrong. From his earliest days, he lived in the shadows, a creature of darkness destined to rise from the depths of human depravity. His path to power was not paved with honor, wisdom, or nobility. No, it was paved with blood, violence, and fear. He was a man who learned quickly that the world could be ruled not through compassion or diplomacy, but through sheer terror. In the beginning, he was nothing more than a marauder, a common thief roaming the vast, desolate plains of Central Asia. He looted villages, terrorized helpless people, and reveled in the fear he caused. It was here, in the chaos of these early raids, that Tamerlane's true nature began to emerge. With each successful raid, his hunger for power grew stronger, and it was in these early bloodbaths that he discovered the weapon that would make him feared across continents: terror. His first bloodbaths were not merely the kind of battles fought by seasoned warriors, where both sides could claim their casualties and warriors would die for their cause. No, these were massacres. Entire villages were slaughtered without mercy. The land would run red with blood, and the air would be thick with the screams of the innocent. Tamerlane's forces, brutal and ruthless, showed no quarter. Men, women, and children alike fell beneath the swords of his soldiers, their lives snuffed out in an instant. Tamerlane's thirst for power was unquenchable, and the slaughter was not just a byproduct of his raids, it was a strategy. It was in these blood-drenched fields that Tamerlane realized he could instill fear in a way few had ever done before. He learned that fear, more than any weapon, would make people bow to him. These early campaigns were not just about taking what he wanted. They were about making people afraid to even think about resisting him. It wasn't enough to simply kill the enemy. Tamerlane made a point of leaving his mark, carving out a legacy of horror. He wanted the world to know that his name meant death, and anyone who stood in his way would suffer a fate worse than death. The villagers who survived his raids would flee into the wilderness, carrying with them stories of the monster who had visited their homes, stories of a bandit who had turned into something much, much worse. And it wasn't just the people he killed that suffered. He made sure the living felt the weight of his terror as well. He would leave behind the bodies of the dead displayed in gruesome ways, their heads severed and piled into towers, their limbs twisted into grotesque shapes. He wanted people to see the aftermath of his violence and tremble at the thought of what he could do to them if they ever crossed him. Tamerlane's rise was not one of noble battles or glorious victories. It was a steady climb to the top built on the corpses of the innocent and the broken spirits of those who lived to tell the tale. The cruelty Tamerlane wielded was not a mere facet of his character. It was the foundation of his empire. He understood that to rule a world, one must not just conquer it. One must break the will of its people. He perfected the art of terror, using it as both a tool and a weapon to reshape the landscape of Central Asia in his image. Each city he razed, each village he destroyed, added to the legend of his cruelty. The bloodshed that Tamerlane initiated became the cornerstone of his identity. His name was no longer that of a bandit. It was a symbol of ruthless power, an embodiment of the horror that awaited anyone foolish enough to oppose him. But Tamerlane didn't stop with mere terror. No, his thirst for power had transformed him into something even darker. He was not just a conqueror anymore. He was a monster, a living nightmare whose ambition knew no bounds. He had tasted the sweetness of victory, but even more intoxicating to him was the fear he inspired. And it was this fear that he would use to shape the world in his image. The bloodbaths he initiated became more than just strategic maneuvers. They became rituals, sacrifices to his insatiable hunger for control. With each massacre, his power grew, and the more blood he spilled, the more invincible he felt. As the years passed, Tamerlane's fame spread like wildfire, carried by the whispers of those who had witnessed the horrors he left behind. His name became synonymous with death itself. People feared him more than they feared the natural elements. His presence alone could reduce cities to ruins. He was no longer a mere bandit on horseback. He was an embodiment of wrath, a force of nature that bent the world to his will. And yet, this was only the beginning of his transformation. His rise was not the product of mere ambition. It was a manifestation of something far darker within him. The more terror he spread, the more it consumed him. He had become something inhuman, a creature whose only purpose was to impose his vision of the world upon others, no matter the cost. By the time Tamerlane began to amass an army capable of conquering entire empires, the world already viewed him as something more than a man. He was a monster, a legend whose name was uttered in fearful whispers by those who had heard the stories. He had surpassed the limitations of what a mere bandit could achieve. His ambition had driven him to the brink of madness, and now there was no turning back. The horrors he had unleashed upon the world were no longer a means to an end. They were his way of life. The terror he had sowed had become his identity, and there was nothing that could stop him now. In the eyes of the people, Tamerlane was no longer a conqueror. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of death that would never be appeased. His early days as a bandit were but a precursor to the nightmare he would unleash upon the world. His thirst for power, his insatiable hunger for dominance, had transformed him into a being beyond human understanding. The world had witnessed the birth of a monster, and now it was up to them to survive the aftermath of his terror. The bloodbaths were not an isolated event. They were the beginning of a reign of terror that would span across nations, reducing cities to ash and leaving a trail of death in his wake. And for those who dared to stand against him, the price would be unimaginable. Tamerlane had become more than just a man. He had become a living nightmare. Tamerlane, in his unyielding quest for power, chose the ancient city of Samarkand as his capital, a place that would symbolize his reign of terror. Samarkand, however, was no ordinary city. It was a city built on the corpses of the innocent, a place where the bones of the dead formed the very foundation of its streets, and the blood of the slaughtered stained its walls. The city, under Tamerlane's rule, ceased to be a thriving center of culture or commerce. It became a twisted reflection of his monstrous will, a hellish kingdom that embodied everything he stood for: violence, death, and unrelenting cruelty. Samarkand, once a beacon of knowledge and civilization, was now a haunted soul, a city that could not escape the eternal curse of Tamerlane's bloodlust. The very land itself seemed to mourn its fate, cursed to forever bear the weight of its creator's wrath. The skies above Samarkand, once a bright, hopeful blue, were now a murky shade of gray, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from the horrors unfolding below. Every stone, every building, every structure in Samarkand was a testament to the brutality of Tamerlane's conquest, a reminder that those who fell beneath his sword would never be forgotten. But in this city of death, Tamerlane saw only his triumph. The screams of the innocent became a melody that played endlessly in his ears, a song of conquest that fed his insatiable hunger for control. The brutal occupation of Samarkand began not with a siege, but with an act of terror that would resonate through the ages. As Tamerlane's forces marched into the city, they brought with them a wave of destruction so complete, it left no hope for those who lived there. Every citizen, from the elderly to the infants, was doomed from the moment Tamerlane's banners were raised above the city. Those who dared resist were quickly eradicated, their bodies either buried beneath the rubble of the destroyed buildings or displayed as grim warnings for anyone who might even think of standing against him. But it wasn't enough for Tamerlane to simply kill them. No, his cruelty knew no bounds. He reveled in the suffering of his enemies, deriving a sadistic pleasure from the pain he inflicted. Resistance, in his eyes, deserved the most brutal of fates, and he made sure that those who defied him were not merely killed, they were utterly destroyed. Tamerlane's soldiers, trained in the ways of death, were no strangers to brutality. They would execute entire families, burn villages to the ground, and scatter the ashes to the wind. The streets of Samarkand ran red with the blood of the dead, and the air was thick with the stench of burning flesh. No one was safe. Even the defenseless were dragged from their homes and slaughtered without mercy, their lives snuffed out in an instant, their bodies left to rot in the streets. Tamerlane's forces were relentless, methodical in their execution of his will, and they showed no hesitation in carrying out the brutal orders given to them. The city, once home to thousands, was now a hollow shell of its former self, its buildings standing like twisted monuments to the destruction that had befallen it. Samarkand, now under Tamerlane's control, had become a city of ghosts, a place where the souls of the dead lingered in eternal torment. The bones of the slain were not buried, but incorporated into the very fabric of the city, used to build the walls and foundations of Tamerlane's new kingdom. The cruel ruler saw this as a way to cement his power, to ensure that his victory over Samarkand was permanent. He wanted the city to be a reminder to everyone who entered that it was built not with the sweat of laborers, but with the suffering of the innocent. As Tamerlane gazed upon his new capital, he saw not a city of progress or culture, but a monument to his cruelty, a place where death was both the beginning and the end. The citizens of Samarkand, if they were lucky enough to survive the initial onslaught, found themselves enslaved in their own homes. The once thriving city now served as a dark reminder that even the greatest cities could fall to the might of one man. Tamerlane's soldiers roamed the streets, imposing his iron will on anyone who dared defy him. The people of Samarkand, crushed under the weight of Tamerlane's occupation, had no choice but to submit to his rule. They were forced to watch as their homes were turned into graves, their families wiped out, their city transformed into a hellish wasteland. For those who resisted, the consequences were swift and unforgiving. Tamerlane, always cruel, would not allow any act of defiance to go unpunished. To refuse him was to sign your own death warrant. The brutality of Tamerlane's occupation extended beyond mere acts of physical violence. His cruelty was not only demonstrated through the slaughter of the innocent, but also through his psychological torment. He would often spare a few people, just enough to send a message, only to watch them wither under the constant fear of death. He would keep them alive, not out of mercy, but as instruments of terror. These survivors, broken by the horrors they had witnessed, were forced to live in a city that no longer resembled the one they had once known. The once beautiful gardens of Samarkand were now overrun with the bodies of the fallen, and the once thriving markets were now eerily quiet, save for the whispers of those who dared to speak of the horrors that had taken place. Even the most revered landmarks of the city were turned into places of death. The great mosques and palaces were desecrated, their halls filled not with prayer and joy, but with the sounds of agony and despair. To walk the streets of Samarkand was to walk through a nightmare. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the once proud architecture now stood like broken bones, reminders of the city's former glory. Tamerlane's cruelty extended to the very heart of Samarkand. He forced the people to build him a new palace, one that would be the seat of his power, constructed from the very bones of the city's dead. It was as if he wanted to make it clear that no one would ever be able to forget the horrors he had wrought. The palace, a twisted structure of stone and bone, stood as a monument to his power, a symbol of the fact that he had conquered not just the city, but the souls of its people. And inside the palace, Tamerlane's rule was one of unrelenting control, where every movement, every word, every action was dictated by his whims. No one dared defy him, for to do so would mean certain death. Samarkand had ceased to be a place of life. It was now a place where death ruled supreme, where Tamerlane's iron fist grasped the city in an unbreakable hold. And yet, Tamerlane was not content with simply ruling Samarkand. No, his ambition stretched far beyond the borders of this once great city. Samarkand was only the beginning, the first step in his quest to build an empire of death. He saw the city as a symbol of his power, a place that would serve as a base for his future conquests. But to those who lived under his rule, it was nothing more than a prison, a city of haunted souls, where the memory of the dead lingered in every corner, in every shadow, and in every breath of the wind. The walls of Samarkand whispered the stories of those who had perished, their souls forever trapped in the city's cursed embrace. For Tamerlane, Samarkand was not just a city, it was a tool, a weapon in his arsenal of terror. He knew that if he could turn Samarkand into a fortress of fear, he could then use it to spread his influence to every corner of the world. He sought to create a kingdom where death was the ultimate power, where the very air people breathed was thick with the fear of his presence. Samarkand was his proving ground, and it would be the foundation upon which he would build his empire. But for those who lived there, Samarkand was not a kingdom, it was a tomb. In the world of conquerors, there have been few whose names have been etched into history with the same level of infamy as Tamerlane. His ambition, far beyond the realm of ordinary rulers, was something darker, something that could never be quenched. His thirst for power and dominance, fueled by the relentless desire to bring death to every corner of the world, began to take its most horrifying shape during the massacres of Herat and Sistan. These were not the campaigns of a conventional leader. They were the obliterations of entire civilizations, cities, and peoples. For Tamerlane, every conquest was not a victory. It was a curse, a relentless march towards further destruction. His name became synonymous with annihilation, and the lands he touched were never the same. Herat, a prosperous city at the time, would never recover from the horrors he unleashed upon it. It became the first in a long line of ruined cities that stood as a testament to Tamerlane's monstrous will. The city of Herat, once full of life, bustling streets, and proud people, became the scene of one of the most horrifying bloodbaths in history. Tamerlane did not see Herat as a city to be conquered. He saw it as another opportunity to showcase the full extent of his cruelty. He did not come to the city with the usual expectations of war and conquest. He came to destroy. And destroy he did. In a single night, Tamerlane slaughtered tens of thousands of people. The people of Herat, caught off guard by the ferocity of his attack, had no chance to resist. Tamerlane's forces, well-trained and merciless, moved through the city with deadly precision. No one was spared, not even the elderly, the sick, or the children. Tamerlane had no respect for life, no remorse for what he did. His soldiers did not simply kill their enemies. They obliterated them, erasing every trace of Herat from the earth. By the time the bloodshed was over, the once thriving city was nothing more than a desolate, blood-soaked wasteland. The streets were covered in a carpet of corpses, the air thick with the stench of death. The ruins of Herat became a grim monument to Tamerlane's desire to impose his will on the world. This was not a war, it was a massacre, a calculated, unprovoked act of violence that left nothing behind. Tamerlane's cruelty knew no bounds, and in Herat, he demonstrated the full extent of his viciousness. His soldiers did not merely kill the inhabitants, they mutilated them. The bodies of the dead were often left in grotesque positions, their limbs contorted in unnatural angles. Women and children, unable to flee, were slaughtered in their homes, their cries of terror echoing through the streets as Tamerlane's soldiers marched on. There was no mercy for Herat, no possibility of survival. The people had no weapons, no defenses. They were unprepared for the fury that Tamerlane unleashed upon them. The city, once a beacon of hope and prosperity, was reduced to rubble in the blink of an eye, its inhabitants wiped off the map, leaving only death and destruction in their wake. The massacre of Herat was not a singular event. It was the beginning of Tamerlane's unholy conquests. From that moment on, every city he touched would suffer the same fate. His wars were not fought to claim territory, to win land, or to establish dominion. They were fought to satisfy his insatiable hunger for death, to impose his will on the world through sheer violence. Each conquest, each city destroyed, was a testament to his unchecked cruelty. And Herat was just the first. What he had done to Herat was a message to the world. To stand against him was to invite utter annihilation. And so, the cycle of violence continued, with Tamerlane's armies sweeping across the land, leaving no one alive to tell the tale. His reputation spread far and wide, and those who heard of him trembled in fear, knowing that to cross him was to face certain death. But Tamerlane was not satisfied with merely destroying one city. The massacre of Herat was just a stepping stone in his quest for domination. His next target was Sistan, a land to the south, where he would carry out even more gruesome atrocities. In Sistan, Tamerlane's forces didn't just conquer, they decimated the entire region, leaving nothing but death and despair in their wake. The people of Sistan, like those in Herat, had no idea what was coming. They lived in ignorance of the terror that was about to unfold. But when Tamerlane arrived, it was already too late. His forces swept through the land, slaughtering the inhabitants with ruthless efficiency. No man, woman, or child was spared. Those who attempted to flee were hunted down like animals, their lives snuffed out in an instant. The bodies of the dead were left where they fell, scattered across the barren landscape like discarded playthings. Tamerlane's forces did not stop until every living soul in Sistan was dead, their homes and villages reduced to ash. The land, once rich with life, became a graveyard, a cursed, desolate wasteland that would never again know peace. The memory of the massacre would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, if they were fortunate enough to live at all. As with Herat, the people of Sistan were not merely killed, they were erased. The very concept of the city, the people, the culture, the land was destroyed. Tamerlane's conquest was not just about winning a battle. It was about obliterating everything in his path, leaving no trace of the past. Sistan, like Herat, became a ghost town, its name erased from the maps of history. There would be no revival, no rebuilding, no remembrance of what had once existed there. Tamerlane's wars were not just victories, they were obliterations. And this pattern would continue, as his thirst for blood drove him to conquer more lands, destroy more cities, and leave nothing but destruction in his wake. Tamerlane's name became synonymous with death, and the lands he conquered were never the same. The people who lived there before him, their cultures, their histories, were all but forgotten, swallowed whole by the wrath of the man who could not be stopped. Every conquest Tamerlane undertook became a curse. To be conquered by Tamerlane was to be sentenced to death, literally and figuratively. It wasn't just the people who perished, it was everything they had built, everything they had known. The cities, once vibrant with life, became nothing more than charred ruins, their histories erased from the pages of time. The lands he conquered were left barren, their once fertile fields turned to dust. And even the memory of those who had lived there was consumed by the darkness that Tamerlane spread. His wars were not campaigns of conquest, they were campaigns of total annihilation, a brutal expression of his insatiable lust for power. The world he left in his wake was a world where cities once filled with the joy of life had become mere shadows, their names whispered in fear and dread. Herat and Sistan were just the beginning of Tamerlane's unholy conquests, the first in a long series of blood-soaked campaigns that would reshape the very fabric of the world. His wars were not fought for glory, for honor, or for the betterment of his people. They were fought to satisfy a hunger that could never be quelled, to impose his will on the world through sheer force. With every conquest, Tamerlane added to the pile of corpses, leaving nothing behind but ruins and whispers of terror. For those who had the misfortune of living in the lands he conquered, Tamerlane's name became synonymous with death. His conquests were not just military victories. They were curses, leaving the lands he touched forever scarred, both physically and psychologically. Herat and Sistan were just two cities, but they were the first to fall under the weight of Tamerlane's wrath, and they would be forever marked as symbols of the brutality he would unleash on the world. Tamerlane's name, etched into the very fabric of history, is synonymous with terror, a figure whose legacy is one of unimaginable brutality. With every conquest, every victory, he cemented his reputation as a ruler whose cruelty knew no bounds. After his devastating conquest of Isfahan, Tamerlane's penchant for horror reached a new and horrifying peak, one that would forever change the way the world viewed him. His forces had slaughtered thousands of the city's inhabitants, mercilessly wiping out anyone who dared to resist or even look at him the wrong way. But Tamerlane, ever the cruel tactician, wasn't content with just killing. He sought to leave a lasting message, a legacy built on fear. And so, in a grotesque display of his power, Tamerlane ordered the severing of thousands of heads, which were then stacked into towering structures that reached toward the sky. These towers of skulls were not mere trophies of war. They were chilling reminders of the price one would pay for defying Tamerlane's rule. He didn't just want to conquer the land. He wanted to break the spirits of those who lived in it, to ensure that no one would dare oppose him again. The sheer scale of the towers was a testament to the mind of a man who saw death not as a mere end, but as a tool to craft fear, a tool to solidify his iron grip on the world. To walk through the streets of Isfahan after Tamerlane's forces had passed through was to witness hell on earth. The city, once a thriving hub of culture and commerce, was now a shadow of its former self, its streets littered with the corpses of its fallen citizens. The air, thick with the stench of death, was suffused with an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the abandoned homes. And yet, this was not the true horror that awaited the people who were unfortunate enough to witness Tamerlane's conquest. No, the true terror lay in the towers. Built from the skulls of the thousands who had been killed in the aftermath of the conquest, these grotesque monuments loomed over the city, casting long, chilling shadows over the land. The skulls, some still bearing the remnants of life, were stacked one upon the other in massive piles, their hollow eyes staring blankly at the sky. The towers themselves were not constructed with care or artistry. They were nothing more than piles of death, thrown together in a haphazard fashion, a crude monument to Tamerlane's need to instill terror. There was no beauty in these structures, only the stark reminder of the thousands of lives that had been snuffed out, their bodies left to rot beneath the sun. And above it all stood Tamerlane's message, plain for all to see: defy him, and this would be your fate. But these towers of skulls were not merely a means of reminding the survivors of Isfahan of their vulnerability. They were a deliberate act of terror, a symbol of the horror Tamerlane intended to spread across every land he touched. His name would be synonymous with death, and he would make sure that it was feared, respected, and never forgotten. To those who saw these towers, to those who passed through the conquered cities where Tamerlane had placed his grisly trophies, the message was clear. Defiance would not be tolerated, and those who stood against him would pay the ultimate price. The heads that adorned the towers were not just the remains of the dead. They were a permanent reminder, a part of the landscape of fear that Tamerlane had carefully crafted. These structures were a visual representation of his unyielding power, a way for him to say, "This is the price of resistance," and to make sure that no one who lived under his rule would ever forget it. Hell on Earth, Tamerlane's conquests, were not just about gaining territory or extending his empire. They were about making a statement, about establishing a reign of terror that would burn itself into the memory of every person who dared to live under his shadow. Death, in Tamerlane's world, was not just the end of life. It was a tool, a weapon that he wielded with terrifying precision. His ability to command death, to use it as a means of control, was unparalleled. Where other rulers might have sought to inspire loyalty through kindness or respect, Tamerlane sought to inspire fear, knowing that the most effective way to rule was to make the people tremble at the very thought of defying him. He would not let them forget the consequences of rebellion. And in the Towers of Skulls, he created a symbol of his power that would be impossible to ignore. The cruelty of these acts was compounded by the fact that Tamerlane did not simply kill to win wars. He killed to make a point. For him, victory was not about taking land or resources, but about breaking the will of those who lived in it. His conquest of Isfahan was not just about defeating an enemy. It was about asserting his dominance over everything that existed in the city. The slaughter of thousands was not a mere battle. It was a campaign of terror designed to ensure that no one would ever challenge his reign again. And when the city was reduced to ashes, when the blood of the innocent soaked into the earth, Tamerlane's message was clear. There was no mercy. There was no second chance. There was only the rule of fear, the law of the strongest, and the inevitability of death. And yet, the towers were not just for the conquered. They were for Tamerlane himself as well. Each severed head, each skull that was added to the towers, was a testament to his power, a mark of his success in crushing the spirit of the people who lived in the cities he had raised. They were a reminder to Tamerlane that he was unstoppable, that there was no force in the world that could stand against him. Each tower, towering above the ruined city, was a symbol of the death he had unleashed upon the world. They were his personal trophies, his way of ensuring that no one could ever forget the path of destruction he had carved through the world. In these Towers of Skulls, Tamerlane saw not just the bodies of his enemies, but the confirmation of his vision of empire, a world ruled by terror, where no one was safe from his wrath. They were a part of him, a reflection of his soul, a grim reminder that he was not just a conqueror, but something far darker. For the people who lived in the lands that Tamerlane had yet to conquer, the stories of the Towers of Skulls spread like wildfire. It wasn't just the physical destruction of the cities that made them tremble. It was the knowledge that they could be next, that the same fate could await them if they dared to resist. These towers were not just monuments to the dead. They were warnings, visceral, graphic reminders of the cost of defiance. The people of the world knew that the only way to survive was to bow to Tamerlane's will, to surrender without question, because to do otherwise was to face a death more terrifying than any they could imagine. The towers were Tamerlane's way of ensuring that his empire would be built not just on the blood of the dead, but on the fear of the living. And in this, he succeeded beyond even his own expectations. As Tamerlane marched across the lands, conquering city after city, the Towers of Skulls remained his most chilling calling card, his unmistakable signature on the world. They were his way of telling the world that there would be no respite, no mercy, and no escape from his wrath. The towers that Tamerlane built in Isfahan became one of the most horrifying aspects of his reign, a symbol of his total and absolute power. They were not just monuments to the death he had caused. They were permanent fixtures in the landscape of his empire, reminders that terror had become the foundation of his rule. To witness the towers was to witness the scale of Tamerlane's cruelty, the depths to which he would go to ensure that his dominance was never questioned. They were not just physical structures. They were psychological tools, instruments of fear that would haunt the people for generations. Even after Tamerlane's death, the memory of the towers, the memory of his unrelenting cruelty, would live on. And in the end, that was the true legacy of Tamerlane. The terror he instilled in the hearts of his enemies, the lasting message that death would always be his answer, and that fear would always be his weapon. The Towers of Skulls, built with the heads of the fallen, would remain a permanent reminder of the dark reign of a man whose cruelty had no equal. Tamerlane's conquest of Baghdad stands as one of the most horrifying chapters in his reign of terror, a dark and grotesque act that solidified his place in history as one of the most brutal conquerors to ever walk the earth. When Tamerlane set his sights on Baghdad, it was not just a city he wished to conquer. It was a symbol of his insatiable hunger for power, control, and death. And, as he had done so many times before, he did not simply aim to conquer Baghdad in the traditional sense. No, Tamerlane wanted to annihilate it. He wanted to turn the city, once a thriving center of knowledge, culture, and commerce, into a monument to his cruelty and madness. And in a single morning, he succeeded. Tamerlane's forces swept through the streets of Baghdad, and by the time the sun had risen, nearly 90,000 innocent civilians lay dead, their lives snuffed out in an instant. It was not just a massacre, it was an act of pure, unrelenting destruction, a barbaric show of power meant to remind the world of Tamerlane's unyielding cruelty. He did not just kill to win a battle, he killed to make a statement, to break the spirit of those who might dare to resist him. The blood ran thick through the streets of Baghdad, and the very air itself seemed to mourn the loss of life, heavy with the stench of death and the cries of the innocent. For Tamerlane, this was not just war. It was something far darker, something that could never be undone. In the wake of the slaughter, Tamerlane did not simply rest in the comfort of his victory. No, he sought to cement his reign of terror, to leave behind a legacy of horror that would be remembered for centuries. To that end, he commanded the construction of skull towers, massive, grotesque structures made from the severed heads of the dead. These towers were not just a symbol of his conquest. They were a chilling testament to his madness, to the depths of cruelty he had sunk to in his quest for dominance. The skulls, some still fresh, others already beginning to decay, were stacked upon one another in piles so large that they seemed to reach toward the heavens. These towering monuments to death were a reminder that Tamerlane's power was absolute, that no one who stood against him could ever hope to survive. The streets of Baghdad were now lined with these grotesque symbols, towering above the city like dark, twisted monuments to a ruler who had no respect for life. The skull towers were his way of saying, "This is what happens when you defy me." And to anyone who might have still entertained the thought of resistance, they were a clear warning of the fate that awaited them. But the towers were only the beginning of the horror that Tamerlane unleashed upon Baghdad. The city, once a thriving center of learning and culture, was now a wasteland, its people reduced to nothing more than a memory. The libraries of Baghdad, containing the accumulated knowledge of centuries, were set ablaze, their ancient scrolls and manuscripts reduced to ash. For Tamerlane, the destruction of knowledge was as important as the destruction of life. To him, nothing was sacred, no institution, no history, no culture. In his mind, the more he destroyed, the more he asserted his power. And so, as the flames consumed the libraries, the knowledge of generations was lost forever. The intellectual heart of Baghdad, its very soul, was obliterated in the blink of an eye. Tamerlane's forces did not simply kill. They erased everything that had once made Baghdad great. They took not just the lives of the people, but the very essence of the city itself. And when the fires had died down and the smoke had cleared, all that remained was the rubble of what had once been a beacon of learning and enlightenment. The devastation that Tamerlane wrought upon Baghdad was not an isolated event. It was part of his larger strategy of terror. For Tamerlane, war was not about victory, it was about annihilation. His conquest of Baghdad was not just about defeating an enemy. It was about erasing everything that stood in his way, about making a statement to the world that no one, no city, no people were safe from his wrath. He sought to turn every city he conquered into a monument to his cruelty, a living nightmare that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. And in Baghdad, he succeeded beyond even his own twisted expectations. The blood of the innocent had soaked into the streets. The libraries were nothing but smoldering ruins, and the once great city had been reduced to a shell of its former self. The skull towers stood as grim sentinels over the wreckage, their twisted forms a permanent reminder of the horrors that had unfolded there. To walk through the ruined streets of Baghdad after Tamerlane's conquest was to enter a city that had lost everything. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the silence was broken only by the sound of footsteps on the rubble. The people who had survived the massacre were broken, both physically and mentally. The sight of the skull towers, looming over the ruins like dark, oppressive giants, served as a constant reminder of what had been lost. The survivors, if they were lucky enough to still be alive, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, surrounded by the remnants of a city that had once been a center of culture, knowledge, and civilization. The libraries, the scholars, the merchants, all had been wiped out, their contributions to the world erased in a single, terrible morning. The fate of Baghdad was a warning to the world. Resistance to Tamerlane would not be tolerated. And to those who still clung to the hope of rebuilding, the skull towers stood as an unyielding reminder that the past was gone, and the future would be nothing but an extension of the darkness he had unleashed. Tamerlane's conquest of Baghdad was not just a military victory. It was a statement of intent, a declaration of his unrelenting desire to crush everything in his path. He did not conquer to rule, he conquered to destroy. His wars were not battles fought for land or power. They were campaigns of annihilation, where the objective was not to claim territory, but to leave a trail of death and destruction that would forever change the world. The skull towers were a physical manifestation of his brutality, and the burning of the libraries was a symbolic act of erasure. Baghdad, once a thriving beacon of knowledge and culture, was now a ghost city, a place where the past was buried beneath the weight of Tamerlane's cruelty. And as the towers of skulls loomed over the remains of the city, they became a permanent part of its history, a haunting reminder of what had been lost. The people of Baghdad, those few who managed to survive, were left to live in the shadow of Tamerlane's wrath. They could never forget what had happened, never erase the image of the skull towers from their minds. The memory of that terrible morning, when nearly 90,000 lives were extinguished in an instant, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The city itself, its once beautiful buildings now reduced to rubble, would never recover. The blood that had soaked into the streets would remain there forever, a part of the very fabric of the city. And the skull towers, towering above the ruins like silent sentinels, would remain as the ultimate symbol of Tamerlane's cruelty, a reminder that, for all the greatness Baghdad had once known, it had been brought low by a conqueror whose thirst for death could never be sated. Tamerlane's conquest of Baghdad was not just a military action. It was a moment of horrific finality, a moment when the past was erased and the future was shaped by the unrelenting power of a man who knew no mercy. His actions in the city were not just about defeating an enemy. They were about asserting his dominance, about ensuring that the world knew who ruled it. And as the skull towers stood tall over the ruined city, they became more than just a symbol of conquest. They became a symbol of terror, of a man whose only purpose was to bring death and destruction wherever he went. Baghdad, once a jewel of the Islamic world, was now a wound that would never heal, a scar on the landscape of history, forever marked by Tamerlane's madness and cruelty. The city and the world would never forget the price of defying him. Tamerlane's invasion of India is one of the most infamous chapters in his legacy, a cruel and merciless campaign that marked not just the conquest of a land, but the obliteration of sacred cities and the total destruction of everything in its path. The city of Delhi, revered for centuries as a beacon of culture, religion, and history, would become the backdrop for one of Tamerlane's most horrifying acts of savagery. His invasion was not simply a military operation. It was a ruthless act of desecration, a calculated effort to turn what was once a thriving and holy place into a hell on earth. The invasion of Delhi was marked by sheer brutality, with Tamerlane's forces slaughtering hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in brutal and unspeakable ways. The streets of Delhi, which had once echoed with the sounds of life, were soon filled with the silence of death. The city became a smoldering ruin, its walls stained with blood, its temples desecrated, and its people destroyed. For Tamerlane, victory was not just about conquering territory. It was about annihilating everything that stood in his way, turning the sacred into the profane, and erasing any trace of those who dared to defy him. The people of Delhi, both the innocent and the guilty, were swept away in a tide of death that seemed unstoppable. They were not just killed, they were utterly erased, and the city itself was transformed into a graveyard, a desolate place where the memory of its former glory could never be revived. As Tamerlane's forces descended upon Delhi, the very air seemed to thicken with the promise of death. The invaders did not arrive as soldiers seeking a victory. They arrived as harbingers of destruction, intent on bringing the city to its knees. The men, women, and children of Delhi were caught off guard by the overwhelming power of Tamerlane's army. With every city he had conquered, he had perfected the art of terror, and now Delhi would feel the full force of his wrath. The city, which had once been a center of learning, trade, and religious significance, was now reduced to a battleground, its sanctity shattered by the bloodshed that rained down upon it. Tamerlane's forces moved through the streets with terrifying precision, cutting down anyone who dared to resist, and those who had the misfortune of being caught in their path were subjected to the most gruesome fates imaginable. The air was filled with the sounds of screams and the stench of burning flesh as Tamerlane's soldiers carried out their orders with cold efficiency. Entire families were torn apart, their homes reduced to ashes. The sacred temples and shrines, once places of worship and peace, were desecrated and defiled. To Tamerlane, the destruction of Delhi was not just a victory, it was a statement. He wanted the world to know that even the holiest of places were not safe from his wrath, that no city, no matter how revered, was beyond his reach. In his mind, the more he destroyed, the more he solidified his power, and the more he instilled fear in those who lived under his shadow. The massacres in Delhi were not isolated incidents. They were part of Tamerlane's broader strategy of terror. His goal was not just to win battles. It was to break the spirit of the people, to make sure that no one, not even the most powerful or revered cities, could stand against him. In Delhi, Tamerlane achieved this with horrifying success. His soldiers did not simply kill the enemy, they obliterated them, leaving nothing behind but death and destruction. Entire neighborhoods were wiped off the face of the earth, their inhabitants slaughtered in a frenzy of violence. The streets were filled with the bodies of the fallen, their blood staining the cobblestones, their lives taken in an instant. And yet, the true horror of Tamerlane's invasion of Delhi lay in the sheer scale of the destruction. He did not just kill the people, he erased them. The city itself became a tomb, its once proud structures reduced to rubble, its streets filled with the silent witnesses to a massacre. The survivors, those few who managed to escape the violence, were left to wander through the ruins of their city, haunted by the memory of what had been lost. They were not truly alive, but ghosts, wandering through a place that had been turned into a living nightmare. Tamerlane's forces did not just destroy Delhi. They made sure that nothing remained to rebuild, to remember, or to recover. The Indian cities that fell to his army were not simply conquered. They were obliterated, turned into graves where the survivors were as much ghosts as the dead who lay beneath them. The very fabric of the city was torn apart, its cultural heritage lost forever. The once immense libraries of Delhi, which housed countless texts and works of art, were burned to the ground, their knowledge lost in the flames. The temples, which had stood for centuries as places of reverence and worship, were desecrated, their idols smashed and their sacred relics stolen. To Tamerlane, the destruction of these symbols of faith was just as important as the physical annihilation of the people. He sought to break not just their bodies, but their spirit, and by desecrating their sacred sites, he ensured that no piece of the old Delhi would remain. The people who had once filled the streets with the sounds of their culture and their beliefs were now gone, their lives extinguished, their contributions erased from history. But even the survivors were not spared from Tamerlane's wrath. Those who lived through the massacre found themselves trapped in a city that had become a nightmare. The streets, once filled with bustling markets and lively chatter, were now empty and silent, save for the echoes of the dead. The smell of burning flesh hung in the air, mixing with the acrid scent of smoke from the destroyed buildings. The survivors, few in number, were left to wander through the streets, unsure of what to do next. Many of them had lost everything, their families, their homes, their livelihoods. And yet, in the face of such overwhelming loss, they found no solace. The city that had once been their home was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of destruction. They were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, but there was nothing left to rebuild. The devastation that Tamerlane had wrought upon Delhi was so complete that even the survivors were left feeling as though they had been erased, just like the city itself. For them, there would be no recovery, no revival, only the haunting memory of what had once been. Tamerlane's invasion of Delhi was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern that defined his reign. Everywhere he went, death followed in his wake, and every city that fell to him became a symbol of his unrelenting cruelty. Delhi, once one of the most vibrant and culturally rich cities in the world, became another in a long line of ruined cities that had been destroyed by Tamerlane's hand. The Indian cities that fell to his army were not just conquered. They were erased, their histories, cultures, and people wiped from existence. And yet, Tamerlane was not satisfied with simply conquering a land. He wanted to break the spirit of its people, to turn their cities into graves where the survivors could do nothing but remember the horror that had been unleashed upon them. The terror that Tamerlane inflicted upon Delhi was a testament to his unyielding thirst for power, and it served as a warning to the rest of the world that no city, no matter how sacred, was safe from his wrath. In the end, Tamerlane's invasion of Delhi was not just a military conquest. It was an act of pure destruction, an effort to turn the sacred into the profane and to erase any trace of resistance from the world. The people of Delhi, both the living and the dead, were left to suffer the consequences of Tamerlane's actions, and the city itself was left in ruins, a smoldering testament to his cruelty. For those who survived, there would be no rebuilding, no return to normalcy. Delhi was no longer a city. It was a graveyard, a place where the memory of what had been could never be revived. The survivors of Tamerlane's invasion were left to wander through the ruins, haunted by the memories of what had been lost, and cursed to live in a city that had been turned into a living nightmare. Tamerlane's campaign in India was not just about defeating his enemies. It was about making a statement, about asserting his dominance over everything that stood in his way, and about turning sacred cities into hell on earth. The people of Delhi, and all those who followed, would never forget the price of defying Tamerlane's unrelenting thirst for blood and destruction. Tamerlane's conquests were not merely military victories. They were apocalyptic events, the kind of disasters that reshaped the very geography of the lands he touched. Every village around Anatolia and Aleppo that found itself in his path was not merely captured, but obliterated. His army did not march through these regions as typical conquerors might, seizing land and imposing rule over defeated populations. No, Tamerlane's approach was one of absolute destruction. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of mercy, and no escape from the horrific wrath he brought with him. To stand in the way of Tamerlane was to invite utter annihilation, and for the villages scattered across Anatolia and Aleppo, the price of such defiance was swift and merciless. His soldiers did not take these villages, they eradicated them, leaving behind nothing but the charred remnants of homes and lives, turning once thriving communities into nothing more than forgotten ashes. Tamerlane's relentless fury was a force of nature, one that could not be stopped. The villagers, who had once lived peacefully, working their fields, raising their families, and going about their daily routines, found themselves in a nightmare they could not wake from. Tamerlane's approach to conquest was not one of traditional warfare. He did not believe in capturing and occupying. It was the eradication of any resistance that fueled his campaigns. The villages that lay in his path were completely destroyed. Homes were reduced to smoldering ruins, their wooden frames burned to the ground, their thatched roofs turned to ash. The land itself seemed to weep, the soil turned black and scorched from the fires that raged across the countryside. The people of these villages had no choice but to flee or face certain death. Those who tried to resist, who dared to take up arms or form a defense, were shown no mercy. Tamerlane's forces overwhelmed them with ruthless efficiency, cutting down anyone who dared to fight back. And those who tried to escape the inferno were hunted down like animals, their lives snuffed out without hesitation. The survivors were left to wander through the ashes of their former homes, haunted by the destruction that had been wrought upon them. The ruins of these villages became their prisons, where the memory of their former lives was slowly suffocated by the overwhelming terror of what had been done to them. Tamerlane did not leave these villages as they were, with a few scars and traces of the destruction he had caused. No, he wanted these places to be as empty as the souls of those he slaughtered. His approach was methodical, ensuring that no trace of life was left behind. Even the dead were desecrated. The bodies of those who had fallen in the struggle were piled high, their remains left to rot in the streets, a grim monument to the death that had come to claim them. The land was stripped bare, the crops burned, and the livestock slaughtered. Tamerlane's conquest was a complete and utter decimation. There was no rebuilding after his visit, no recovery. His soldiers did not merely kill. They left the survivors in a state of despair, with no means of survival. The ashes of their homes and livelihoods were all that remained, and in the oppressive silence that followed, the people of the destroyed villages could do nothing but remember what they had lost. In his mind, Tamerlane was not just conquering territory. He was shaping the world in his image, a world of death and terror, a world where no one could ever hope to defy him without paying the ultimate price. The destruction of the villages around Anatolia and Aleppo was not merely a byproduct of Tamerlane's campaigns. It was his signature. These villages were not just obstacles on his path to power. They were tools, instruments to be used to send a message to the world. To oppose him was to face the complete erasure of everything you had ever known. Tamerlane's armies did not just claim victory in battle. They turned victory into something darker, something more final. In the wake of his campaigns, no enemy was left standing, and no sign of the old world remained. The villages that once dotted the countryside were reduced to nothing but scattered ashes, and the people who had once called them home were either dead or left to wander in a world that had been stripped of everything they held dear. There was no escape from Tamerlane's wrath, not in the villages, not in the cities, not in the fields or the forests. The conquest of these lands was not the result of a series of battles. It was the consequence of standing in the way of a man whose desire for destruction knew no bounds. His reign was one of relentless punishment, a dark shadow that stretched across the land, erasing everything in its path. Merciless death followed wherever Tamerlane's forces went. To him, resistance was not just a challenge. It was a reason to wipe entire populations from existence. He saw the world not as a place to rule, but as a place to conquer, to dominate, and to crush beneath his heel. His armies were not mere soldiers. They were instruments of terror, sent forth to carry out his will with ruthless precision. When they reached the villages around Anatolia and Aleppo, there was no hesitation, no mercy. The people there were not simply defeated, they were obliterated. Even the slightest sign of resistance was met with brutal retribution. Tamerlane had no tolerance for defiance. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to send a message, a warning to anyone who might even think of opposing him. He wanted to break the will of the people, to make them understand that their lives meant nothing in the face of his fury. And to ensure that the message was heard, Tamerlane's forces did not just kill. They burned, they pillaged, and they destroyed. Nothing was spared from their wrath, and nothing was left behind. The villages that had once thrived were reduced to nothing, their people lost to the winds of history, their names forgotten beneath the weight of Tamerlane's unrelenting campaign. In his mind, every victory was a nightmare for those who fell beneath his sword. The people of these villages didn't just lose their homes, they lost their identities, their cultures, their very way of life. Tamerlane's campaigns left nothing but devastation in their wake, and the survivors who managed to escape were left to wander in a world where nothing was familiar, where everything had been stripped away by the fire of conquest. For them, the world had been turned into a place where survival was a curse, and memories of a life before Tamerlane's wrath seemed like distant dreams. The villages that had once dotted the landscape were now gone, their remnants scattered in the wind, and in their place stood nothing but the specter of what had once been. Tamerlane had not just conquered these lands, he had consumed them, leaving behind only the ashes of what was once a thriving, vibrant world. No resistance was tolerated, no mercy was given. Every village that stood in Tamerlane's way was turned to ash, its people reduced to shadows in a history that was drenched in blood. Tamerlane's campaigns were not about glory, nor about the expansion of his empire. They were about something far darker, the desire to bring destruction, to reduce the world to a place where fear and death ruled supreme. The villages around Anatolia and Aleppo were not just conquered, they were erased, their people and cultures lost to the flames of Tamerlane's fury. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of survival for those who stood in his way. And as Tamerlane's forces swept across the land, leaving behind a wake of death and destruction, the world began to understand that his hunger for power could never be satisfied. His name became synonymous with annihilation, and the villages that fell beneath his army were just the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch across entire continents. The memory of these destroyed villages would haunt the survivors for generations to come, a reminder that to cross Tamerlane was to invite total obliteration, to be swallowed whole by the darkness of his unrelenting will. In the end, the villages around Anatolia and Aleppo were not just part of Tamerlane's conquest, they were victims of his madness. They were erased not because they were enemies, but because they stood in the way of a man whose only goal was to turn the world into a reflection of his own twisted desire for destruction. Tamerlane's relentless pursuit of power and dominance left a trail of ruin in its wake, and the villages that once thrived in the fertile lands of Anatolia and Aleppo became nothing more than forgotten memories, lost to the passage of time, their people swept away in the tide of death that Tamerlane brought with him. The history of these villages was not one of triumph or survival. It was one of erasure, a bleak and unending story of destruction that would forever be etched into the annals of history. The remnants of their existence lay scattered in the ashes, a reminder that no place was safe from the wrath of Tamerlane, and no person could escape the nightmare he had created. Tamerlane, a man whose very name has become synonymous with terror and destruction, was not only a conqueror through sheer might. He was a master of the psychological game, a manipulator whose cruelty extended beyond the battlefield. While his armies marched across lands, destroying everything in their path, it was the mental torment he imposed on his enemies that truly set him apart from other conquerors. Tamerlane understood that while strength in battle would win him victories, it was deception, betrayal, and the breaking of spirits that would solidify his reign. His ability to exploit the hope of mercy, only to turn that hope into a death sentence, was one of his most chilling traits. He didn't simply want to defeat his enemies. He wanted to destroy them, body and soul, to leave them broken and fearful. He knew that the most effective way to conquer a city or a people wasn't always through force. It was through the promise of peace, followed by betrayal. By offering the illusion of safety and then ripping it away in the cruelest possible way, he created a psychological environment where no one could trust their own instincts, where no one could ever feel safe. Tamerlane's methods were insidious. He would often approach his enemies with promises of mercy, offering them the illusion that surrendering to him would spare their lives. These promises, however, were nothing more than traps, carefully set to lure the unsuspecting into a false sense of security. The promise of life was never meant to be kept. To Tamerlane, mercy was an illusion, a tool to manipulate his enemies into lowering their guard. He understood the value of hope, the belief that one could survive, that peace could be achieved. It was this hope that he preyed upon, knowing that it would be their undoing. Once his enemies had surrendered, believing they had escaped the wrath of his forces, they would quickly realize that they had only walked into the jaws of a much darker fate. Tamerlane, ever the master of cruelty, would spring the trap, turning the tables with ruthless efficiency. The people who trusted in his word, who believed that they would be spared, would find themselves slaughtered without mercy. The streets would once again run red with blood, and their bodies would become yet another grim statistic in Tamerlane's campaign of fear and death. This use of psychological manipulation was a hallmark of Tamerlane's reign. He understood that fear was a more potent weapon than any sword or arrow, and he knew that the best way to break a people was to make them fear not just death, but the very idea of mercy. To surrender to Tamerlane was to play a game with no rules, where the only certainty was that you would lose. Once you had placed your trust in him, once you had accepted the false promise of life, there was no escape. Tamerlane would grant you a brief moment of peace, allowing you to believe that you had won. Then, when you were least expecting it, he would turn on you with the fury of a storm, turning your life into a nightmare of betrayal and death. The streets of the cities he conquered would become the final resting places of those who had once dared to hope, their lives snuffed out in the cruelest of ways. The most terrifying aspect of Tamerlane's psychological warfare was the fact that it wasn't just about killing people. It was about erasing their hope. By offering mercy and then betraying it, he not only destroyed their bodies but also crushed their spirits. The people who had surrendered to him were not simply victims of war. They were victims of deception, and the trauma they experienced was not just physical but mental. The shock of betrayal, the realization that they had been played, would stay with them even in death. Tamerlane knew that to truly conquer a people, to truly dominate them, one must break their will to resist, and the best way to do this was to manipulate their emotions, to use their hopes against them. When he killed, it wasn't just about taking lives, it was about taking away their last shred of dignity, their last belief in fairness or justice. He was not just a conqueror, he was a destroyer of the human spirit, an architect of psychological torment. The victims of Tamerlane's false promises were often the leaders of cities or factions that had surrendered, believing that their cooperation would ensure their survival. They would be invited to meet with Tamerlane, to negotiate terms of surrender. With silver tongues and honeyed words, Tamerlane would reassure them that they had made the right choice, that they would be allowed to live under his rule, perhaps even serve in some capacity within his empire. These promises were designed to create a sense of security, to make them let their guard down and believe that the worst was behind them. However, once they had surrendered, once they had placed their trust in him, Tamerlane would spring his trap. He would have them surrounded, and before they even had a chance to process what was happening, they would be executed without hesitation. Their families, their soldiers, their allies, none were spared. The promise of life had been a lie, and in its place was a brutal, unrelenting death. Those who had hoped for mercy were left to die in the most cruel of ways, knowing that they had been fooled into believing that their lives were safe. The horror of this betrayal echoed far beyond the immediate victims. The cities and villages that had once hoped for survival were left in a state of shock, knowing that they too could not escape the same fate. Tamerlane's betrayals were not limited to his enemies on the battlefield. He used the same tactics on his own people, his own soldiers, to maintain control over them. He would promise rewards for loyalty, assure them that their service would be rewarded once the conquest was complete. And yet, even his closest allies were not safe from his treachery. If Tamerlane felt that someone had outlived their usefulness, or if they had crossed him in any way, they would be betrayed just as easily as his enemies. No one was exempt from his cruelty, not even those who fought for him. His generals, his advisors, and his soldiers could all be discarded at a moment's notice if they failed to please him. The fear of betrayal hung over everyone in Tamerlane's camp, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust. To be in his service was to live in constant fear of your own death, for you could never be certain when Tamerlane would turn on you. His promises were as empty as the graves he filled with the bodies of the deceived. For Tamerlane, the psychological game was as much a part of his strategy as his military tactics. He understood that true control came not from defeating an enemy in battle, but from breaking them mentally, from making them fear the very possibility of survival. By offering false hope, he trapped his enemies in a web of despair, forcing them to face the reality that their lives were always at his mercy. It was not enough for Tamerlane to conquer a land. He needed to make sure that every person who lived under his rule was broken, that no one ever dared to oppose him again. His use of deceit was a way to remind everyone that nothing was safe from his wrath, that no one could trust in the promises of life, for they were always a prelude to death. The idea of mercy was a mere illusion, one that Tamerlane would use to manipulate his enemies into a false sense of security, only to destroy them when they let their guard down. This was the true nature of his cruelty, not just to kill, but to destroy hope, to break spirits, and to remind the world that nothing could ever stand in his way. Tamerlane's reign was a reign built on the fear of betrayal. His enemies knew that if they surrendered, they might find themselves the victims of the very promises they had placed their trust in. And yet, even those who chose to resist were often defeated by the psychological tactics he employed. His ability to deceive and manipulate was a weapon more potent than any sword, for it broke the minds and hearts of those who dared to cross him. The psychological toll of his betrayals was something that could not be easily shaken off. To live under Tamerlane's rule was to live in a state of constant anxiety, a never-ending battle between hope and fear, where trust was a luxury that could lead to one's undoing. In this world, Tamerlane was the master, and everyone else was a pawn in his game of death and betrayal. For those who encountered him, there was no escape. Not from the battlefield, not from his promises, and certainly not from the twisted manipulation that lay beneath every word he spoke. Tamerlane's conquests were not just military campaigns. They were cataclysmic events that left behind a world forever altered. Cities that had once flourished with life, trade, culture, and history were not merely captured in his quest for dominance. They were wiped from existence. Tikrit and Aleppo, once proud cities, are but whispers now, their once bustling streets and thriving markets turned to dust and rubble in the wake of Tamerlane's passage. His forces did not simply defeat these cities. They erased them, obliterating everything that made them significant. The people who had lived in Tikrit and Aleppo were not just defeated. They were erased, their lives snuffed out in a single, terrifying sweep. The homes they had lived in, the schools they had attended, and the markets where they had traded all became nothing but ashes, forgotten and buried under the weight of Tamerlane's wrath. What remained were the ruins, broken and lifeless, the shadows of a time before death had come to claim everything they held dear. To Tamerlane, these cities were not just obstacles on his path to greater power. They were symbols of resistance, and they had to be crushed utterly, as if they had never existed at all. When Tamerlane's forces descended upon Tikrit, the city was reduced to nothing more than a pile of stones. It had once been a place of great importance, a city that had witnessed centuries of history and culture. But all of that, every trace of the people who had lived there, was swept away in the wake of Tamerlane's arrival. His army, a terrifying force of destruction, did not just march through Tikrit. They tore through it, tearing down buildings, slaughtering the inhabitants, and leaving nothing behind but the charred remains of homes and lives. The city's once vibrant streets, filled with the sounds of people going about their daily business, were silenced in an instant. The air, once filled with the cries of merchants selling their wares and children playing in the streets, was now thick with the screams of the dying and the acrid smoke of burning buildings. The people of Tikrit, unable to resist the overwhelming force of Tamerlane's army, were slaughtered without mercy. Those who attempted to flee were hunted down, their lives extinguished in a blink. Tikrit, once a thriving city, was now a place of death and destruction, its soul forever lost in the flames of Tamerlane's wrath. Tamerlane's conquest of Aleppo was no different. The city, which had once been a major cultural and economic hub, was turned into a graveyard. The streets of Aleppo, once bustling with life, were now eerily silent, save for the echoes of Tamerlane's soldiers marching through the city. Aleppo's once proud walls, which had stood for centuries as symbols of the city's strength and resilience, were now reduced to rubble. The market squares, once filled with the vibrant colors of merchants selling their goods, were now covered in the blood of the city's citizens. The city's famous libraries, its archives of knowledge, were burned to the ground, their contents lost to the flames. Aleppo's history, its culture, and its people were erased in a single act of conquest. The buildings, the institutions, and the monuments to a once great city were obliterated, as if they had never existed. There would be no monuments to Aleppo, no cultural legacy to pass down to future generations. There was only ruin and the ghosts of those who had lived there, their stories lost to the winds of history. Tamerlane's forces did not simply defeat Aleppo. They extinguished it, turning the city into a forgotten memory, a place that would never be remembered except as a casualty of his insatiable thirst for destruction. The cities that Tamerlane destroyed were not just physical locations. They were symbols of a way of life, a reflection of the cultures and people who had built them. Tikrit and Aleppo, like so many other cities, had been places of trade, culture, and civilization. They had been the heartbeats of the regions they occupied, the centers of knowledge and history. But under Tamerlane's brutal rule, all of that was destroyed. There would be no monuments to the people who had once lived in these cities. There would be no celebrations of their achievements, no celebrations of the lives that had once been lived there. What remained were the ruins, the shattered remains of what had once been vibrant, bustling cities, now reduced to ghost towns, filled only with the echoes of those who had perished in the wake of Tamerlane's conquest. His legacy was not one of buildings or monuments. It was one of death, and it was one that left nothing but scars on the land. What is perhaps most chilling about Tamerlane's approach to conquest is that it was not just about physical destruction. His campaigns were designed to erase the very identity of the cities he conquered, to erase the people and cultures that had once defined them. The destruction of Tikrit and Aleppo was not just an act of war, it was an act of cultural annihilation. Tamerlane's army did not simply destroy the infrastructure of these cities, they destroyed their very essence. The libraries, the schools, the temples, all of these were burned, their knowledge and culture lost forever. The people who had once lived in these cities were not just killed, they were forgotten, their stories lost to the winds of history. Tamerlane's conquests did not just reshape the map, they reshaped the very fabric of civilization, leaving in their wake a wasteland where nothing could grow, nothing could thrive. His legacy was one of death, not only in the physical sense, but in the cultural sense as well. The cities he destroyed were not just wiped from the map, they were erased from memory, as though they had never existed at all. The aftermath of Tamerlane's invasions left the land scarred and broken. Cities like Tikrit and Aleppo, which had once been centers of culture and history, were now nothing more than empty ruins. Their people, their cultures, and their traditions were wiped out, leaving behind nothing but memories of what had been. The survivors of Tamerlane's wrath, if there were any left to survive, were left to wander through the ruins of their former homes, haunted by the ghosts of the past. There would be no rebuilding, no restoration. The land had been scarred too deeply, and the people had been broken beyond repair. The cities that had once stood as symbols of human achievement were now nothing more than reminders of the price of defying Tamerlane's empire. Tikrit and Aleppo, along with countless other cities, were not just destroyed. They were forgotten, their names lost to the annals of history, their legacies erased by a conqueror whose cruelty knew no bounds. In the wake of Tamerlane's invasions, the survivors of the cities he destroyed were left to live in a world where nothing was the same. The land around them was barren, the cities that had once been their homes now nothing but piles of rubble and ash. The people who had lived in Tikrit and Aleppo were gone, their memories lost to the ravages of time. Tamerlane's legacy was not one of triumph. It was one of ruin, a legacy of destruction that left no room for hope, no space for renewal. The very idea of rebuilding was a cruel joke, for there was nothing left to rebuild. The cities had been completely erased, their histories buried under the weight of Tamerlane's violence. For the survivors, the only thing that remained was the memory of a time before Tamerlane's wrath, a time when their cities had stood tall, filled with life and culture. But now, all that was left was emptiness, a vast void where once thriving civilizations had stood. Tamerlane's approach to conquest was not just about taking land or resources. It was about erasing everything that had come before him. His campaigns were not about building empires. They were about destroying the very foundations of civilization itself. Cities like Tikrit and Aleppo were not simply conquered. They were obliterated, their legacies lost forever. There would be no monuments to the people who had once lived there, no remembrance of the cultures that had once flourished. The only thing that would remain was the memory of Tamerlane's cruelty, a memory that would echo throughout history, reminding the world of the cost of defying his reign. And as time passed, even the memories of these cities would fade, replaced by the endless cycle of conquest and destruction that Tamerlane left in his wake. The cities he destroyed, like so many others, would be forgotten, their names erased from history, their people lost to the sands of time. Tamerlane's legacy was not one of greatness. It was one of erasure, a legacy that left behind nothing but ruins and memories of a time when death ruled the land. Tamerlane's ambition was a force more terrifying than any army he could command, an insatiable hunger that knew no boundaries. He did not simply seek to conquer lands or build an empire. He craved something far darker and more twisted. His was an ambition for control over not just territories and people, but over the very essence of life and death itself. Tamerlane, as he waged his brutal campaigns across the lands, did not envision a world where rulers and nations could coexist. He saw only a world where his power was supreme, where all others would bend to his will, and where fear reigned unchallenged, a world molded by the warped desires of one man. As he carved his name into history through conquest and destruction, his madness grew, fed by each victory, each city he razed, and each life he extinguished. What began as a pursuit of power soon evolved into something far more dangerous, a terrifying thirst for domination so absolute that the concept of mercy was eradicated from his mind entirely. His madness became the driving force of his empire, pushing him to commit atrocities that would forever change the world and erase entire civilizations in the process. Tamerlane's empire building was not driven by the usual desire for riches or prestige. For many rulers, the conquest of new lands was a means to expand wealth, to leave a legacy, or to solidify their rule. But for Tamerlane, these were mere byproducts of his true goal, total domination. He saw the world not as a place of balance or harmony, but as a chessboard where every piece was meant to serve him. His ambition was not satisfied with merely ruling. It was a relentless, obsessive drive to erase all that stood before him, to leave nothing behind but desolation and ruin in his wake. The cities he captured were not merely annexed into his empire. They were destroyed, wiped from the map, their people slaughtered or enslaved, their histories erased. The past, with its monuments, knowledge, and cultures, was of no importance to him. He saw history as something to be rewritten, not just for himself, but for the world he aimed to create. Tamerlane's name was not meant to be just remembered. It was meant to be feared, and he was willing to go to any length to ensure that this fear would spread like wildfire across the lands. As he marched forward with his bloody conquests, Tamerlane's madness grew. His desire for control over life and death intensified, and he began to see himself as a godlike figure, one who held the power to decide who would live and who would die. It was not enough for him to rule through military might. He needed to be the arbiter of existence itself. His army was not merely a tool of conquest, but a means to enforce his will over the very fabric of life. The cities he took were not just locations to add to his map. They were symbols of defiance that had to be crushed, their inhabitants transformed into mere instruments of his power. Tamerlane's madness manifested itself in his treatment of the cities and people he encountered. Instead of establishing peaceful rule, he resorted to terror as his primary tool of governance. His invasions were often preceded by messages of cruelty, warning his enemies that surrender would mean their survival, but betrayal, resistance, or even the smallest hint of rebellion would lead to their utter destruction. He was a man whose judgment was clouded by a vision of total and absolute domination, and every act of cruelty he committed fueled the fire of his madness. The bloodshed that accompanied Tamerlane's campaigns was unparalleled. His wars were not simply battles for land, but for the complete eradication of those who opposed him, and the eradication of the very idea that anyone could defy him. When he conquered a city, it did not become part of his empire. It became a symbol of his dominance. The streets would run with the blood of the slain, the air thick with the screams of the innocent, and the buildings turned into piles of rubble. Cities such as Tikrit, Herat, and Baghdad, once teeming with life, were transformed into ghost towns. These places were not simply conquered. They were destroyed beyond recognition, and Tamerlane took pride in the sheer scale of the devastation. The survivors, if there were any, were left to wander in the ashes of their former homes, their spirits crushed beneath the weight of what they had witnessed. For Tamerlane, there was no need to leave a legacy of monuments or grand structures. He left behind only ruin, a barren wasteland where nothing could grow, not even the memory of the people who had lived there. His ambition was not to create or build, but to erase, to make the world a reflection of his own cruelty. An endless hunger fueled Tamerlane's conquest. It was not enough for him to simply conquer the lands before him. He needed to ensure that nothing was left in his wake but destruction. Every victory was a step closer to the twisted vision he held for the world, a world where he was the sole ruler, and death was his only law. He wanted a world where fear was the only force that held people in line, where resistance was not just futile but impossible, because no one would dare to even think of opposing him. The people who had lived in the cities he destroyed were nothing more than casualties in the ongoing effort to maintain control over the world's fate. In Tamerlane's eyes, they were expendable, just like the cities they inhabited. Their suffering was not just a consequence of war. It was an essential part of his rise to power, a necessary sacrifice to ensure his reign was complete. His campaigns were not about strategic victories or military success. They were about establishing a world where his power was unquestioned, where his vision of fear and terror ruled above all else. And as his madness grew, so did his bloodlust. With each city he destroyed, with each army he defeated, Tamerlane's hunger for more power became even more insatiable. His tactics of cruelty and psychological manipulation were not only directed toward his enemies, but also toward those who served him. Tamerlane was a ruler who demanded absolute loyalty, and anyone who failed to meet his expectations faced swift and brutal punishment. His generals, his soldiers, and even his closest allies lived in constant fear of his wrath. Loyalty was not rewarded with trust or honor. It was rewarded with survival, and even that was not guaranteed. His own army was a tool to be wielded, and those who served him were expendable, just like the cities he conquered. The fear of betrayal or failure was so ingrained in his camp that Tamerlane's soldiers fought not just for victory, but for their very lives. The atmosphere was one of constant paranoia, where no one was safe from Tamerlane's judgment. He would often execute his own officers for even the slightest perceived failure or disloyalty. creating an environment where fear overshadowed reason, and where even the bravest men trembled at the thought of angering their ruthless leader. The psychological toll this took on his soldiers was immense, for they knew that their lives could be taken away in an instant, and for no reason other than the whims of a man whose madness had reached its peak. Tamerlane's obsession with domination was not limited to military campaigns. It extended to the very nature of his rule. His vision for the world was one where he alone held the reins of life and death, and to this end, he did not hesitate to use his power to destroy anything that stood in his way. His ambition for total control led him to see every person, every culture, every civilization as something to be subjugated or erased. He saw no value in preserving the rich histories of the lands he conquered. The cities he destroyed, the people he slaughtered, the cultures he eradicated, they were all part of the larger design in his mind, a design where only his rule mattered. The fact that these people had cultures, families, and histories meant nothing to him. He was determined to remake the world according to his own dark vision, a world where nothing was left standing except for his own legacy of destruction and terror. He wanted not just to rule, but to reshape the very fabric of existence, to make the world a place where his name was the only one that could be spoken without fear. Tamerlane's madness was not something that could be reasoned with or understood. It was an overwhelming force that clouded his every decision, his every action. What began as a lust for power soon grew into something far darker, something that could not be stopped by conventional means. His ambition consumed him, turning him into a tyrant whose desire for control was insatiable. His soldiers, his enemies, and the cities he destroyed became pawns in his game, each one sacrificed to the greater cause of his ambition. The people who had lived in the lands he conquered were not simply subjects. They were tools to be used, discarded, and erased. Their lives held no value to Tamerlane, and neither did the cities they inhabited. The world was not a place of civilization to him. It was a canvas upon which he painted a nightmare of blood and fear, a world where nothing was sacred and nothing was beyond his reach. In the end, Tamerlane's legacy was not one of greatness or glory. It was a legacy of madness, a legacy of destruction, and a world where life and death were his to command. His ambition, unchecked and unrelenting, shaped the world around him into a place where fear reigned supreme, where mercy had no place, and where the very concept of hope was destroyed by the weight of his cruelty. The cities he destroyed, the lives he ruined, the cultures he eradicated, they were all swept away in his wake, leaving only the dark shadow of his rule. Tamerlane did not just conquer lands. He reshaped the very nature of the world, a world where only he could dictate who would live and who would die. His madness knew no bounds, and with each conquest his hunger grew, until there was nothing left in the world but a reflection of his own dark desires. Tamerlane's death did not mark the end of his terror. It only seemed to usher in a new chapter of fear, this time from beyond the grave. His legacy, already soaked in blood and destruction, continued to haunt the world, even in death. The very tomb that was meant to house his remains became the site of something far more sinister. When Tamerlane passed away in 1405, it was believed by many that his spirit would rest quietly in his tomb in Samarkand, the city he had once ruled with an iron fist. However, this was far from the truth. Tamerlane's death did not bring peace or closure. Instead, it seemed to unleash something darker and more dangerous. Over the centuries, rumors swirled around his tomb, whispers of a curse that would follow anyone who dared to disturb his final resting place. The tomb, it was said, was not a place of rest, but a place of doom, a symbol of the ruler's wrath that could not be quelled, even by death itself. And so, the story of Tamerlane's tomb became intertwined with a terrifying legend, one that would not be forgotten, even long after the man himself had passed from this world. In 1941, during the chaos of World War II, the legend of Tamerlane's curse took on a chilling new life. In the midst of the war, Soviet archaeologists, driven by curiosity and perhaps a sense of bravado, opened Tamerlane's tomb. What they uncovered within was a sight both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Tamerlane's body, preserved remarkably well, despite the centuries that had passed since his death. Yet, as the tomb was opened, an eerie sense of foreboding seemed to envelop the site. The air around the tomb grew thick with tension, and those who were present spoke of an unnatural stillness in the atmosphere, as if the very earth had grown heavy with the weight of Tamerlane's legacy. It was as though his spirit had been disturbed, as though the curse that had been whispered about for centuries was finally being unleashed. The timing of this event would prove to be unsettlingly significant, for it was just days after the tomb was opened that the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union began, a moment that would forever alter the course of history. The invasion, which marked the beginning of the horrific Eastern Front of World War II, was devastating, and many saw the opening of Tamerlane's tomb as the moment when the curse had truly taken hold. To those who believed in the legend, it seemed as though Tamerlane's wrath, long dormant, had been resurrected by the disturbance of his final resting place. The curse was not just a story, it was real, and it was now in motion, bringing ruin to the land once more. The curse, however, was not a simple superstition. It was said to be a curse of ruin, an eternal cycle of vengeance that Tamerlane had set in motion during his life. Tamerlane was not a ruler who merely sought power. He sought to control the very essence of existence, to impose his will on the world through sheer force and terror. His conquest of lands, his destruction of cities, and his slaughter of innocent people were not mere acts of war. They were expressions of his unyielding desire to dominate and annihilate everything in his path. Even in death, it seemed as though this desire did not fade. His tomb was a reminder that Tamerlane's vengeance was not bound by the limits of life. To open his tomb was to awaken the force of his rage, a force that could not be contained, even by time itself. The curse of Tamerlane's tomb was a reflection of his madness, his insatiable hunger for destruction that had driven him throughout his life. He had left behind a legacy of death, and even after his passing, it seemed that this legacy would never end. His tomb was not a resting place. It was a symbol of his relentless wrath, an eternal monument to the havoc he had wreaked upon the world. The curse that followed the opening of Tamerlane's tomb was not just a supernatural event. It was a manifestation of his legacy, a continuation of the devastation he had left behind in life. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union was just the beginning of a series of catastrophic events that seemed to follow in the wake of Tamerlane's tomb being disturbed. The world would soon witness the full extent of the horrors that the curse had unleashed. The war itself, with its unimaginable suffering and destruction, seemed to echo the devastation Tamerlane had wrought centuries earlier. The Eastern Front, where millions would die in brutal battles, became a reflection of the terror that had followed in Tamerlane's footsteps. His tomb had not just been a site of history. It had been a portal, a doorway through which his vengeance could be unleashed once more. The world, once again, was caught in the grip of his power, and this time, it seemed there was no escape. The curse of Tamerlane's tomb was not something that could be explained by logic or reason. It was a force that existed beyond the realm of understanding, a manifestation of the unyielding anger and malice that had driven Tamerlane throughout his life. His ambition had never been limited by the boundaries of the living world. His desire for domination had extended into the afterlife, ensuring that his legacy of death would never fade. Those who believed in the curse spoke of the darkness that seemed to envelop the tomb, the sense of dread that hung heavy in the air when it was opened. The tomb was not just a structure of stone and earth. It was a vessel, a container for the rage that Tamerlane had left behind. The curse was not just a series of unfortunate events. It was a reminder that Tamerlane's vengeance had no end, that his spirit could never be quelled, and that his wrath would always find a way to make its presence known. In the years that followed the opening of Tamerlane's tomb, the curse seemed to linger, casting a shadow over the world. The devastation of the war, the millions of lives lost, and the horrors of the Eastern Front were a direct result of the curse that had been unleashed. Tamerlane's tomb was no longer just a relic of the past. It had become a symbol of the destruction that his name carried with it. The opening of his tomb had awakened something dark, something that could not be stopped. And as the world grappled with the consequences of the curse, it became clear that Tamerlane's legacy of destruction would never truly be eradicated. The dead ruler, whose body had been entombed in Samarkand for centuries, had left behind a legacy that extended far beyond the confines of his grave. His ambition, his madness, and his thirst for control had transcended death itself, ensuring that his name would live on in the nightmares of those who dared to disturb his resting place. Tamerlane's tomb, once thought to be a place of finality, had become a symbol of the madness that had driven him throughout his life. It was not just a tomb. It was a testament to his unyielding desire for domination, a monument to the destruction he had wrought upon the world. His death had not put an end to his wrath. It had only seemed to amplify it, making the curse that surrounded his tomb more potent than ever before. The curse was not just a legend. It was a reality, one that had the power to alter the course of history itself. Tamerlane's tomb had not been a resting place for a man who had passed from the world. It had been a prison for the madness that had defined his reign. And once that madness was unleashed, it could not be contained. The world was once again caught in the grip of Tamerlane's vengeance, and there seemed to be no end in sight. His legacy of death and destruction, forged over the course of his brutal conquests, had transcended the mortal realm, and now the world would have to face the consequences. The curse of Tamerlane's tomb was a dark reminder that even in death, there was no escaping his legacy. The opening of his tomb in 1941 had unleashed a force that was beyond human control, a curse that had the power to reshape the world in the image of the mad ruler. It was as though his spirit, though long dead, had never truly left, still lingering in the dark corners of history, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. His tomb had become more than just a final resting place. It had become a portal for his vengeance, a reminder that even in death, Tamerlane's wrath could never be quenched. The curse, once thought to be nothing more than superstition, had proven to be real, and the world would never be the same. Tamerlane had conquered in life, and now, even in death, he would continue to haunt the world with the specter of his madness. Tamerlane, a man whose name became synonymous with brutality and conquest, did not merely shape the world through his conquests. He carved a legacy of blood and destruction that would haunt generations long after his death. His ambition, fueled by an unquenchable thirst for power, left behind not a flourishing empire or cultural monument, but a legacy marked by the ashes of the cities he had obliterated and the bodies of the countless lives he had extinguished. While empires may rise and fall, and new rulers may emerge to claim their places in history, Tamerlane's descendants could never escape the shadow of the horror he had left behind. His name, like a dark cloud, would follow them, tainting every success and every failure, reminding the world that their bloodline was built upon a foundation of terror. Though his successors, such as the Mughal Empire, would go on to hold vast power and influence, they would never be free from the stain of Tamerlane's legacy. The empires they forged, though mighty in their own right, were forever shackled to the madness and cruelty that had defined Tamerlane's reign. The Mughal Empire, perhaps the most famous of Tamerlane's successors, carried with it the weight of a horrifying past. While the Mughals would go on to create one of the most powerful empires in history, they did so on the backs of the same brutal methods that had made Tamerlane a feared figure. The Mughals, with their impressive military prowess and their ability to control vast swaths of land, built upon the foundations that Tamerlane had laid. However, the empire they constructed was not one of peace or cultural flourishing. It was one steeped in the same bloodshed and terror that Tamerlane had used to carve his own empire. The foundation of the Mughal dynasty, like the empire of Tamerlane, was laid in the blood of countless civilians, cities, and cultures that had been erased from existence. The Mughals may have built magnificent structures, such as the Taj Mahal, but they did so upon a foundation of ruins, where once thriving civilizations had been reduced to ashes under the weight of Tamerlane's conquests. The blood-soaked land upon which the Mughal Empire was built was a constant reminder that power in this region had come at a terrifying cost. Even the rulers who rose from Tamerlane's bloodline could not escape the weight of the terror he had wrought. The empires they built, though powerful and influential, were haunted by the same violence and madness that had defined Tamerlane's rule. The Mughals, while known for their advances in architecture, art, and culture, were forever bound to the shadow of their ancestor. Their reign, no matter how successful, was marred by the knowledge that they, too, were the inheritors of Tamerlane's curse. The notion that the world could ever forget the violence of Tamerlane's reign was a false hope. The blood that had been spilled in his name could not be washed away. It remained a permanent stain on the pages of history. And as the Mughal Empire grew in size and power, so too did the ghosts of the cities Tamerlane had destroyed, the souls of the millions he had killed. They lingered in the background, reminding the Mughals and the world that their empire, no matter how glorious, had been born in the flames of terror. Tamerlane, unlike some of his contemporaries, did not seek to build a legacy of culture or lasting influence. His conquests were not driven by a desire to create something that would endure for centuries. They were driven by a need for total domination, for the complete destruction of those who dared to stand in his way. While figures like Genghis Khan sought to leave a lasting cultural impact through the empire they built, Tamerlane's empire was built not on the principles of unity or civilization, but on the blood and bones of the conquered. His campaigns were not aimed at establishing lasting peace or cultural prosperity. They were aimed at erasing everything in his path, leaving behind nothing but ruin. Tamerlane's legacy was one of pure destruction, a bloodbath that did not aim to preserve, but to obliterate. The cities he conquered were not preserved as symbols of his power. They were annihilated, their cultures erased, their people slaughtered. There was no effort to build monuments to the greatness of his empire. Instead, Tamerlane's most lasting monuments were the skull towers he constructed, the gruesome markers of his rule that served only to remind the world of his capacity for cruelty. Tamerlane's empire was, in many ways, a monument to terror. Unlike Genghis Khan, who established a Mongol empire that would go on to influence cultures, trade, and history for centuries, Tamerlane left behind only fear and bloodshed. His empire did not promote lasting unity or growth. It promoted the fear of death and the inevitability of destruction. The Mughals, while they inherited the territory and the military prowess of their ancestor, did not inherit his vision of a thriving world. Instead, they inherited his blood-soaked legacy, a legacy that could never be untangled from the violence and madness that had defined Tamerlane's reign. The idea of building something lasting, of creating a cultural renaissance, was always tempered by the knowledge that their empire had been built upon the ashes of the past. The Mughals might have been great rulers in their own right, but they were forever linked to Tamerlane's horrors. The memory of the cities he had destroyed, the lives he had taken, and the destruction he had wrought would follow them wherever they went. Tamerlane left behind a legacy of blood and ashes, one that no empire could escape, no matter how powerful or prosperous. His vision of the world, one where fear and destruction reigned supreme, had no place for the preservation of life or culture. His empire, built on a foundation of terror, could never be separated from the blood that had soaked the earth beneath it. The Mughals, though they sought to create a new world, were forced to do so atop the ruins of the old one. The cities and civilizations Tamerlane had destroyed were gone, but their memory remained, haunting the world with the knowledge that such destruction could come again. Tamerlane's legacy was not one of cultural flourishing. It was a reminder that power could be seized through cruelty, that empires could be built upon the corpses of the dead, and that the past could be wiped away with the stroke of a sword. His name would forever be associated with fear, not with enlightenment, and his legacy would remain one of violence, a blood-soaked trail across history that left nothing but ruins in its wake. What made Tamerlane's legacy even more insidious was the fact that, while his empire crumbled after his death, the scars he left behind remained. The violence he had unleashed was not confined to the lands he had conquered. It seeped into the cultures and histories of those who survived. The fear he instilled in the hearts of his enemies did not dissipate with the passing of time. It lingered, passed down through generations, a whispered memory of the man who had burned cities, slaughtered innocents, and left a path of death that stretched across the known world. The people who lived under Tamerlane's rule never forgot the horrors they had witnessed, and they could not escape the shadow of the man who had brought them to their knees. Even in death, Tamerlane's presence was felt. His blood-soaked empire may have crumbled, but the terror he had instilled in the world endured long after his body had decayed. The legacy of blood and ashes that Tamerlane left behind was not just a physical one. It was psychological, a deep scar on the collective memory of the world. The cities he destroyed, the people he murdered, the cultures he erased, all of it became part of the darkness that hung over the lands he had conquered. His descendants, the Mughals, could build new cities, create new cultures, and forge new empires, but they could never escape the stain of their ancestors' violence. They could never outrun the shadow of Tamerlane's name, a name that was forever associated with destruction and death. His legacy, one built on cruelty and terror, had no place for peace or prosperity. It was a reminder that the pursuit of power through violence and fear left behind only a broken world, one where nothing could ever truly flourish. The Mughals, for all their greatness, were always haunted by the ghosts of the cities their ancestor had destroyed, the memories of the blood he had spilled, and the knowledge that their empire, no matter how grand, had been built on the ruins of a once vibrant world. Tamerlane, often hailed as one of the most formidable military leaders in history, was a figure whose genius on the battlefield was undeniable, yet his legacy is forever tainted by the horrors he unleashed. For all the praise he has received as a military genius, someone whose tactics and strategies shaped the course of history, there remains an uncomfortable truth that overshadows his achievements. Tamerlane was not just a conqueror, he was a monster. His rise to power was marked by a relentless drive to crush everything in his path, and his methods of warfare, though effective, were defined by sheer brutality. The world remembers Tamerlane not as a hero, but as a demon, an embodiment of pure destruction. His military genius, while remarkable in its own right, was inseparable from the unspeakable terror he wrought upon those who stood against him. The great cities he conquered, the armies he crushed, and the people he slaughtered were the true measures of his success, not in glory or honor, but in the rivers of blood that stained the lands he conquered. For Tamerlane, victory was not achieved through diplomacy or skillful negotiations. It was attained through slaughter, fear, and the systematic annihilation of entire populations. Tamerlane's military campaigns were nothing short of devastating. He did not simply win battles, he obliterated entire civilizations, leaving nothing behind but the bodies of the dead and the ruins of once thriving cities. To speak of his genius as a tactician is to acknowledge the cold, calculating mind that brought entire empires to their knees. But it is also to recognize the terrifying cruelty that lay at the heart of his strategy. Unlike other conquerors who sought to expand their empires through the consolidation of power or diplomatic marriages, Tamerlane sought domination through destruction. His forces swept across the land, leaving cities in flames, towns decimated, and entire populations either slain or enslaved. For him, the act of conquest was not simply about seizing control of land or resources. It was about asserting his will through the complete annihilation of those who stood in his way. Tamerlane's campaigns were characterized by an almost supernatural sense of savagery, with each victory marked not by the usual symbols of triumph, but by grotesque monuments to his power. The skull towers he built from the heads of his enemies were not mere trophies. They were grim reminders of his unrelenting cruelty, a chilling signal that resistance against him was not just futile, it was a death sentence. Historians often point to Tamerlane's military innovations, his use of cavalry, his strategy of feigned retreats, his ability to outmaneuver larger armies, as proof of his genius. And yet, for all of his tactical brilliance, Tamerlane's true legacy is one of terror. His victories were achieved not through the brilliance of his military tactics alone, but through the sheer terror he inspired in those he faced. Cities like Baghdad, Delhi, and Aleppo were not just military objectives. They were symbols of defiance that Tamerlane intended to erase. The people who lived in these cities, once proud of their histories, cultures, and achievements, were slaughtered without mercy, their lives extinguished in an instant. Tamerlane's genius was in his ability to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies, to make them so terrified of his wrath that surrender was seen as the only option for survival. And yet, surrender did not guarantee safety. In fact, it often led to the most horrifying forms of death, as Tamerlane would promise mercy only to betray those who trusted him, slaughtering them once their guard was down. His tactics of psychological warfare were just as effective as his military maneuvers, and the terror he instilled in his enemies was as much a weapon as his soldiers' swords. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Tamerlane's reign was not his battlefield prowess, nor even the scale of the destruction he caused. It was the darkness that seemed to reside within him. He was not a man driven by a desire to build or to create. He did not seek to leave behind a legacy of culture or civilization, as other conquerors might have. Tamerlane's ambition was rooted in a singular, terrifying goal: to dominate the world through fear and death. He sought not to build an empire, but to create a world where his name was the only one spoken, where his rule was the only one that mattered. His conquest of cities was not an act of expansion but of erasure, as he wiped out entire populations, obliterating cultures and histories that had existed for centuries. To Tamerlane, nothing was sacred, not cities, not people, not the very idea of civilization itself. His empire was a product of death and destruction, and his name became synonymous with annihilation. While historians may praise Tamerlane for his military genius, they cannot escape the truth that his empire was built upon the suffering and blood of countless innocents. His genius, as remarkable as it may have been on the battlefield, was inseparable from his cruelty. Tamerlane's tactics were not just about defeating an enemy. They were about making them suffer, about breaking them physically and psychologically. The cities he conquered were not just seized, they were utterly destroyed. Tamerlane's forces would lay siege to a city, and when it fell, they would massacre the population, leaving nothing but the bodies of the dead and the ruins of the city. The act of conquest was not complete until every man, woman, and child had been wiped from the earth. His soldiers would burn the city to the ground, pillage its wealth, and leave the survivors to wander in the ruins of what had once been their home. There was no mercy for those who resisted, and no respite for those who submitted. Tamerlane's wrath was all-encompassing, and no one, no matter their rank, age, or status, was safe from the consequences of his campaign. Tamerlane's cruelty knew no bounds. He did not only target soldiers or military leaders, he destroyed entire populations. The innocent were not spared, nor were the elderly, the women, or the children. He would often order the execution of those who had surrendered, those who had placed their trust in his word, as if to prove that no one could escape his wrath. In cities like Herat, Samarkand, and Isfahan, Tamerlane's soldiers were instructed to kill indiscriminately, to leave no survivors. His campaigns were marked by horrific massacres, where entire families were slaughtered, their bodies left to rot in the streets. The people of these cities, once full of life, were reduced to nothing but corpses, their names lost to history. The blood that soaked the streets of these cities was a testament to the true nature of Tamerlane's rule. His empire was not a beacon of civilization or culture. It was a kingdom of death, built upon the bones of the dead. The face of Tamerlane, as history has preserved it, is not the face of a conqueror or a ruler. It is the face of a man whose madness defined his reign, whose cruelty was his signature, and whose ambition led to the destruction of everything in his path. Tamerlane did not seek to leave behind a lasting legacy of cultural achievement. Unlike figures such as Genghis Khan, whose empire helped shape the world in profound ways, Tamerlane left behind only fear and destruction. His empire was not one of peace or stability. It was one of chaos and terror, where the only certainty was that death could come at any moment, and there would be no mercy. His empire, if it can be called that, was built not on the strength of a people united in purpose, but on the fear of a tyrant whose wrath could never be escaped. History will remember Tamerlane not as a conqueror, but as a demon, a creature of pure destruction whose reign was nothing but an endless cycle of terror and death. His name will forever be linked with brutality, his empire with cruelty. Tamerlane's legacy is one of fear, not glory, and it is a legacy that will haunt the world for centuries to come. His wars were not fought for honor, nor for the betterment of his people. They were fought to satisfy his insatiable thirst for power, for domination, for the utter eradication of any resistance. He was a man who saw no value in life, no purpose in civilization, and no room for mercy. His empire, if it can be called such, was built on the ruins of the cities he destroyed, the bodies of the people he murdered, and the terror that he instilled in the hearts of those who dared to stand against him. Tamerlane's true nature was not one of military genius. It was one of madness, a madness that consumed everything in its path, leaving only death and destruction behind. Tamerlane, also known as Timur, is a figure whose name echoes through history as a symbol of humanity's darkest impulses. A man whose ambition and cruelty left behind a legacy so haunting that it cannot be erased, no matter how much time passes. His reign, marked by unrelenting violence and terror, stands as a grotesque reminder of the potential for destruction that lies within the heart of man. Tamerlane's conquests were not driven by a desire to build or create. They were driven by an insatiable thirst for power, domination, and a complete disregard for life itself. To speak of Tamerlane is to speak of destruction on an unimaginable scale, of entire cities reduced to rubble, of innocent lives extinguished in the blink of an eye, and of cultures erased as if they had never existed. His name will forever be associated with the total annihilation of life and hope, a reminder that even the mightiest of empires, when built on cruelty, cannot last without leaving scars so deep that they never heal. Unlike other conquerors, whose empires may have left behind monuments, art, and lasting contributions to civilization, Tamerlane's empire was built upon a foundation of blood and death. He did not seek to establish lasting legacies of culture or prosperity. Instead, he sought to destroy and to reshape the world in his image, where the only thing that mattered was his will. The cities he conquered were not preserved as symbols of victory. They were razed to the ground, their inhabitants slaughtered without mercy. Baghdad, Delhi, Samarkand, and Aleppo. These were not just cities in his empire. They were the graves of thousands, if not millions, of people whose only crime was living in Tamerlane's path. Where other rulers might have built universities, cultural institutions, or lasting monuments, Tamerlane left behind only ruins and bones. His ambition knew no bounds, and his legacy, steeped in blood, has forever marked him as one of history's greatest monsters. He sought not glory but annihilation. He did not conquer to create. He conquered to erase, and his legacy is one of complete destruction. Tamerlane's conquests didn't leave behind the grand cities or cultural achievements that one might expect from a conqueror of his stature. His empire did not prosper through the spread of knowledge, the flourishing of the arts, or the growth of trade. No, Tamerlane's empire was built on the corpses of the innocent, on the ashes of cities that had once been centers of culture and civilization. The destruction he brought was so absolute that the ruins of the cities he sacked stand today as a testament to the violence and cruelty of his rule. In cities like Herat, Samarkand, and Baghdad, the vibrant life that once filled the streets was extinguished, leaving only silence and devastation in its wake. The people who had once lived in these cities were either slaughtered or displaced, their cultures and histories obliterated by the sword of Tamerlane's army. Where once there were temples, schools, and markets, there was now nothing but rubble. The libraries, the homes, the sacred shrines, these were all destroyed in a single, horrifying sweep. Tamerlane left behind no cultural legacy, no monuments to the achievements of his people. Instead, he left behind an eternal testament to death and destruction, a world where the very concept of progress was buried under layers of blood and broken dreams. What makes Tamerlane's legacy so chilling is not just the scale of the destruction he wrought, but the method by which he achieved it. His campaigns were not only military victories. They were acts of terror, calculated to instill fear in the hearts of anyone who might dare to resist him. He didn't just defeat his enemies, he obliterated them. Entire populations were wiped out, their cities turned into burning husks, their bodies left to rot in the streets. He was a master of psychological warfare, using fear as his most potent weapon. Cities that surrendered to him, hoping for mercy, often found themselves betrayed and slaughtered once they had let their guard down. The cruelest aspect of Tamerlane's reign was his complete lack of mercy. For him, surrender was merely an opportunity to destroy more completely, to show the world that there was no escape from his wrath. His soldiers would storm through the streets of conquered cities, cutting down everyone in sight, with no regard for age, gender, or status. His victory was not just the defeat of an enemy, it was the total destruction of everything they had built. And once that victory was achieved, Tamerlane would leave nothing but the echoes of suffering in his wake. The bloodshed that defined Tamerlane's reign is a hallmark of his legacy, one that will never fade from the pages of history. His campaigns were marked not by the noble ideals of conquest, but by the bloodstains of those he left behind. Cities that once thrived as centers of culture and commerce became nothing more than empty shells, their people either slaughtered or enslaved, their histories wiped away by Tamerlane's brutality. He was a man who sought to impose his will upon the world, not through diplomacy or leadership, but through sheer terror. He was not a conqueror who built or nurtured an empire. He was a destroyer, an agent of chaos whose only desire was to erase all that stood in his way. The very concept of mercy was foreign to him, as he believed that the only way to rule was through fear. His empire was built not on the cooperation of the people, but on their submission to his terror. Those who survived his wrath were left with nothing but memories of their former lives, memories that were slowly buried by the unrelenting march of time. Tamerlane's legacy is therefore not just one of military conquest, it is one of fear, death, and destruction. His empire was not one of progress, but one of backwardness, where the arts were crushed, education was destroyed, and civilization was set back centuries. The people who lived under his rule were not given the opportunity to thrive. They were forced to live in a world where survival was the only concern. Tamerlane's empire was not one of enlightenment. It was one of darkness, where the light of civilization was snuffed out by the brutal hand of a tyrant. The history of the lands he conquered is not one of growth or advancement, but one of regression and destruction. The cities that once served as beacons of human achievement were reduced to rubble, their people lost to the flames. And even those who survived found themselves living in a world that had been irreparably scarred by the violence and cruelty that Tamerlane had unleashed. Tamerlane's reign was a reign of terror that had no equal. His name became synonymous with death, and his empire was built on the corpses of the innocent. But his legacy was not just a matter of numbers, of the millions who died in his wake. It was also a matter of the psychological toll he took on the world. The fear he inspired in those who opposed him was unlike anything the world had seen before. He did not just seek to conquer land. He sought to conquer the very spirit of those he faced, to break them through sheer force. His campaigns were marked by acts of cruelty that were beyond the imagination of those who lived under more traditional rulers. He did not just defeat his enemies, he crushed their will to resist, leaving them broken and defeated. And for those who survived, the psychological scars of his rule were just as damaging as the physical ones. Tamerlane's empire was not just a political entity, it was a reign of terror, where survival itself was a form of victory. The world that Tamerlane left behind was a world irrevocably altered by his cruelty. His name, once feared across the lands he conquered, became a symbol of the darkest chapter in history. The legacy he left was not one of greatness, it was one of horror. And this legacy will never fade, no matter how much time passes or how many empires rise and fall. The cities he destroyed, the people he killed, and the cultures he erased are reminders that Tamerlane's reign was not one of glory. It was one of unrelenting destruction. His empire may have crumbled after his death, but the scars of his rule are still felt today. History will never forget Tamerlane, not as a conqueror, but as a demon, a creature whose reign was nothing but an endless cycle of terror, death, and devastation. In the end, Tamerlane's legacy will forever be defined by the blood he shed and the lives he destroyed. He was not a conqueror in the traditional sense. He was a force of nature, a being who reshaped the world through sheer force and violence. His empire, built on a foundation of death, is a stark reminder that even the most brilliant military minds can become monsters when their ambition is unchecked. Tamerlane's name will forever be associated with suffering, his story a warning to future generations about the horrors of unrestrained power and unchecked madness. He was not a ruler, but a destroyer, a being whose existence will haunt the world for as long as history is remembered. His reign, though it has passed into the annals of time, will never be forgotten. It lives on in the legacy of blood and ash that he left behind, a testament to the terrifying power of a man who sought not to build, but to break, not to rule, but to ravage, leaving nothing but terror in his wake. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, good night.